Welcome to the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.
Endless journey of delight and profitability.
I think some people use it as a derogatory term towards accountants.
Being visible to the employees is important.
Hey, listeners, welcome once again to the Asset Reliability at Work podcast. I'm your host, Derek Kelly, and of course with me is Tara Holwegner.
Hi, everyone.
So in today's episode, we have an excellent guest on the podcast, and that is Bill Barto, who's a Senior Reliability Engineer SME at Lifecycle Engineering. What's going on, Bill?
Hey, how are you doing, everybody?
Things are actually going really great, Bill. Thanks for asking. And Tara, why don't you go ahead and kick us off and tell the listeners why Bill is joining the podcast today?
Bill is joining us to explain 4 methods of how reliability engineering professionals can create more awareness for how their reliability activities contribute to business results. So, Bill, in your article, you go into great detail about being noticed for the work you perform, specifically preventive work, which is not always the most exciting to a lot of people. So why don't you talk to us about that? Why is it important to have your manager or supervisor notice reliability activities, even if they're considered routine maintenance?
That's a great question. So getting them noticed, to me, is really the first step in being able to continue and sustain beginning or, just these we talk to a lot of folks who are just starting up reliability departments or groups or just starting their career. And the best way I see to be able to build that momentum is really to get people to notice what you're doing. It's vital that you're able to articulate the things you're doing and put it into, like we'll talk a little bit later, the language, the right verbiage, things that your people understand so that you get that momentum building so that you can continue to see the results and all the great things that you're working on.
Okay. So, in your article, you had this interesting example, maybe an analogy, more like an analogy of a child, whether or not they would want to be a firefighter or a fire marshal when they grew up. So explain that analogy as it kind of relates to this conversation.
Yeah. So I wish I could take ownership of that analogy, but it came from when I was early in my career as a reliability engineer. Paul Behringer used to use that analogy, and I think it fits perfectly. And the idea of what gets people excited, what's the thing that continues to get you up in the morning, and for a lot of folks, it's that firefighter mentality, right? It's the sexy part, right? We make firefighter calendars. We don't make fire marshal calendars, right?
Right.
It's what usually gets the attention. And my analogy was, go out and ask a bunch of kids whether they'd rather be a firefighter or a fire marshal. And you know what the answer is going to be. They're all going to want to be firefighters. So there's something, I think, intrinsically attractive about being in a position where you're the one that's being called on. You're the one that's getting the call at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and rushing in to save the day. And we all understand that that's a reactive culture. Unfortunately, the role of the fire marshal, which may not be as attractive and be as sexy, is really where those proactive techniques and that proactive work is actually taking place. That's the guy who says you can't store the combustible material next to the ignition source, right? He's the one that's saying you got to have fire protection. Where's your smoke detectors? Where's your sprinklers? Those are the things that are going to keep the fire from ever really starting, or at least mitigate the consequences of that fire. And that's, it is what it is. And unfortunately, it doesn't always get the attention that it deserves. The managers are the ones that are heaping the accolades onto the firefighters in most cases. And fire marshals aren't getting as much attention as I think they deserve.
You surveyed 92 people in the reliability profession, reliability engineers, and you asked the question, what type of maintenance work gets more recognition in their facility? So what were the results? What were the responses to that, and did they surprise you in any way?
Yeah, so what I ended up finding out was almost half of the people that replied to that confirmed my belief in that the emergency work is really what gets that recognition, those attaboys, those pats on the back. I would have honestly, I would have thought it would have been a little higher. There was quite a significant number of people, maybe 1 in 5, that said that their predictive work in their organization gets some accolades. And I think that's great. I mean, that's awesome. That ought to be the way we're heading. I congratulate those organizations that are able to get their managers and leadership team thinking about that's where the recognition ought to go. And if I were to do that survey again today, I would hopefully see that number of recognition and the amount of recognition going towards those predictive activities to be a lot higher. And maybe we're starting to swing the pendulum that way.
Well, I think that's a good segue to talk about what can we do. Let's move on to the 4 methods you write about in your article about how to best demonstrate the value of preventive maintenance activities so they don't get taken for granted. The first is the need to consider your audience. Can you explain more about that?
I think the timing of this podcast is really good because I was able to listen to Robert's podcast the other day about, being able to talk to your financial folks about the what you're doing and how to gain that, write that business case. And so this goes right along with that. What we're used to as reliability engineers in a lot of cases is speaking in reliability speak. We're using metrics like MTBF and maybe even uptime. But what do those folks that we're talking to speak? What kind of language do they speak? Do they understand MTBF? I find lots of reliability engineers who don't completely understand MTBF, where it comes from. So we can expect that those folks in the leadership roles, they're not speaking that language. They don't understand what that means when I say, hey, my MTBF got greater. Well, is that good? Is that bad? I don't understand what that is. But so if I'm making widgets, let's talk about how many more widgets I was able to make. If I'm worrying about, how many people I can move through a process, well, then let's talk about how many more people I was able to move through the process. If we're talking about gaining revenue, let's talk about how much more revenue I was able to gain by making these improvements. So it's really goes back to, I'm glad that I was able to sneak into the podcast right after Roberts, but that's great that he said it really well, that you got to know what the language is. You got to know who you're speaking to and be able to turn those improvements, those things that you're doing out there in the field, into something that they understand.
Right. So to clarify 2 things. First of all, thanks, Bill, for giving a shout out to an earlier episode.
I'm just glad you watched it or listened
Robert
to it.
Vendetti, and you can find that on our podcast. So maybe we'll link to it as one of the resources here. But second, MTBF, mean time between failure. So, Bill, you're saying don't throw out the acronyms that the reliability engineers think are cool. Think about talking about how, because we didn't fail, this is what we did. And because we didn't fail, it took us 2 years to fail instead of 6 months. This is what we were able to recover. Now, those take a long time, so probably
right.
shouldn't use that example. But
Robert talked about going back to the guiding principles or those annual, the goals that are set out there, right? We should be talking in the same way he brought it up. Those small projects, those tactical things that I'm doing out in the field, how can I phrase that into one of those goals, right? My MTBF went up. Well, what that really means is that time between my failures got less and less, which means in a certain amount of time I had less and less failures. Well, less and less failures probably means I was able to make more and more of these things. Well, here's a goal that says we're going to produce X number of widgets a year. Well, look what I did. All right, I'm making more widgets a year. But would they understand it if I put it in MTBF went from 10 to 15. Are they going to understand what that means? Are they going to get really excited about what that means?
Well, I think that leads right into your second point, which is now that you've got the language, you should show and tell. It's more about demonstrating improvements. So talk to me about how we can demonstrate the accomplishments.
One of the best ways I think you can demonstrate anything to anyone is through graphical means, right? I think a picture says 1,000 words, right? So I like to find ways to graphically show my improvements, be it improvement in a trend or a KPI or some output in that language that we've talked about using. For me in particular, I'm a big fan of what we call a Crow-AMSA chart. Crow-AMSA charts are excellent at being able to plot a event over time and whether that event is coming in a more frequent or a less frequent rate. One of the great things about this is you don't need a whole lot of data. If you're looking at events, downtime events or any other kind of event, some failure event, and you know the date that it happened and you can then calculate the amount of time in between each one of those events, then you can use a Crow-AMSA plot to graphically show those points over time and show trends. Is it getting better? Hopefully your improvement represents a point in the chart, and you can show that, hey, I can just look at this and see that after I took my action and I changed the PM, or we upgraded the oil in the gearbox, that the trend changed, and it changed in a positive way. And you can see that in one slide, one picture, one piece of paper you can take over to your manager's desk. So I think being able to show it graphically through something like a CRO-AMSA chart with very little limited data is an excellent way to be able to put things in their language and show it to them in a real easy way.
All right, so consider your audience being the first one. Show and tell was the second one. So now your third method is give it to them straight. And this comes after we've developed the right language for the audience and we've demonstrated our value, like you said, via some sort of graphical representation or any kind of visual representation for that matter. But now we have to be conscious about the details we're presenting. Talk us more through that.
So this kind of comes against one of my pet peeves, and that's just graphics and charts and plots that don't have enough description or have a lot of extra information that just sort of muddies up the details, right? It just gets in the way of really trying to digest and understand what you're really trying to say. So one of the unintended consequences of Excel these days and the ease of being able to plot things real quick with just putting some numbers down in a spreadsheet is that it's just click buttons. I can click a button and turn on the axes. I can click another button and make the minor line show up. And I can click on it and put the formula for the line right there on the chart themselves. And the dots can be huge and small or yellow and with a outline of a different color. Well, all those things to me get in the way of really trying to demonstrate those improvements. So be very, very careful about the amount of information that's necessary to be able to get your point across. And so in the example I used in the article, I got rid of the axes, got rid of all those lines, those vertical and horizontal lines. I made the dots small. I changed the color for before my improvement versus after my improvement. I did use some trend lines, so that helps to understand things, but I got rid of all that extra detail that really doesn't help. The other thing that I did is I labeled my plot in English. The points on the graph and the legend, they sometimes just show up as series 1, series 2, series 3. Get rid of that, right? What's actually going on there? These are downtimes before the activity. These are downtimes after. Also put a nice big text block in there. Write down what it was that you actually achieved and what you did. Don't be afraid to add the details in the right spots and just get rid of all that stuff that really doesn't go towards making your point.
As a huge fan of the show The Office, I believe Michael Scott would say, keep it simple, stupid.
That's exactly it, right? Yeah.
So stay visual, but don't take it too far. Remember what your message is. Tie it to the goals, I guess, that you were talking earlier about. What's that end game, and what does the person you're trying to convince or make aware of your accomplishments, how much can they digest? And what can you share with them that's meaningful?
Telling a story. So everything in your chart, in your graph, and whatever you're presenting needs to contribute to that story. And things that aren't contributing to that story or that are going to catch somebody's eye and lead them down the wrong path, you want to eliminate those things, anything that's not contributing to your story.
Very nice. So your last method is to be bold. In your experience, what's the most effective way to be bold?
To me, to be bold is to be confident in what you're presenting. So now that you've gotten the story, right, your graphical picture, your story of what it is you're presenting on your improvement, don't be afraid to go out there and present it. Monitors in break rooms are great opportunities to be able to demonstrate and show the whole plant, the whole facility about what your improvement did. Get it published in a newsletter. Put out your own newsletter if you need to. Make sure that you get that recognition that you deserve. I think a lot of people in some cases are reluctant to want to draw a lot of attention to themselves. They know that they did a good job. They know that what they did had a positive impact on the plant. But it's important, like we said at the very beginning, right, to be able to gain traction in your program, to be able to move it to the next level, to be able to iterate it into something bigger. You need to make sure that people are aware of the work that you're doing which sometimes may be data-driven, sitting in a desk, working on a computer day after day. You get the recognition for that you deserve. So I think you got to get the confidence, and you got to be able to, and you got to be willing to put yourself out there, get people excited about what you're excited about.
That's I love that point because it can resonate with anybody in any kind of position or field of interest. So that's a great
bold.
point. Be bold. Don't be modest.
Be bold.
Thanks, Bill, for joining us today on Asset Reliability at Work. We talked about 4 methods for how reliability engineering professionals can create more awareness in their organization of how their reliability activities are contributing to business results. First, you need to consider your audience, then have the right language, show and tell, give it to them straight, and finally, be bold.
And for those listening right now, I do want to direct you back. When you get a chance, go to our podcast webpage, lce.com/podcast. You're going to find in the show notes there a link to Bill's article that we've been referencing throughout the show. The title was Help Your Reliability Activities Earn the Respect They Deserve. So I hear there's a lot of good examples in there.
Yeah, and in there, don't forget that in that article, if they go to the webpage and find that article, I gave them a step-by-step how-to on how to create my favorite chart, which is that Crow AMSA chart. So there's some pictures of what the chart looked like before and after. There's actually a sample data set they can play around with too. And then I think 11 steps on how to actually create that table and the figure and the graphical output that I came up with too. So they can get that right out of the article.
Well, that's awesome. Wow, that's very useful.
What a great resource. Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. And the last thing that will be on there for you podcast listeners is the link to connect with Bill Barto on LinkedIn. He's definitely a social media enthusiast, and I know if you reach out to him, he'll definitely get back in contact with you with any questions you might have. So connect with him on LinkedIn. So with that being said,
until next time, podcast listeners.
Take care, guys.
Hey, listeners, one more thing before you go. If you have any feedback for the show, or you have maybe some suggestions for upcoming topics you'd love to hear about, we'd like to hear from you. So there's 2 ways to get in contact with us. The first is on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @LCE_today, so be sure to follow us. And then the other way is to email the show at podcast@lce.com. Once again, thank you for joining the show, and we look forward to more episodes on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.